Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 8. Progress of the Quarrel. 1202. Temujin's stratagem succeeded admirably. As soon as he had decided upon it, he began to put it into execution. He caused everything of value to be taken out of his tent and carried away to a place of safety. He sent away the women and children too to the same place. He then marshalled all his men, excepting the small guard that he was going to leave behind until evening, and led them off to the ambuscade where he had chosen for them. The place was about 2 leagues distant from his camp. Temujin concealed himself here in a narrow dell among the mountains, not far from the road where Van Khan would have to pass along. The dell was narrow and was protected by precipitous rocks on each side. There was a wood at the entrance to it also, which concealed those that were hidden in it from view, and a brook which flowed by near the entrance, so that in going in or coming out it was necessary to ford the brook. Temujin, on arriving at the spot, went with all his troops into the dell and concealed himself there. In the meantime, the guard that had been left behind in the camp had been instructed to kindle up the campfires as soon as the evening came on, according to the usual custom, and to set lights in the tents so as to give the camp the appearance, when seen from a little distance in the night, of being occupied as usual by the army. They were to wait and watch the fires and lights until they perceived signs of the approach of the enemy to attack the camp, when they were secretly to retire on the farther side and so make their escape. These preparations and the march of Temujin's troops to the place of ambuscade occupied almost the whole of the day, and it was near evening before the last of the troops had entered the dell. They had scarce accomplished this manoeuvre before Van Khan's army arrived. Van Khan himself was not with them. He had entrusted the expedition to the command of Sankum and Yamuka. Indeed, it is probable that they were the real originators and contrivers of it, and that Van Khan had only been induced to give his consent to it, and that perhaps reluctantly, by their persuasions. Sankum and Yamuka advanced cautiously at the head of their columns, and when they saw the illumination of the camp produced by the lights and the campfires, they thought at once that all was right, and that their old enemy and rival was now, at last, within their reach and at their mercy. They brought up the men as near to the camp as they could come without being observed, and then, drawing their bows and making their arrows ready, they advanced furiously to the onset and discharged an immense shower of arrows in among the tents. They expected to see thousands of men come rushing out of the tents or starting up from the ground at this sudden assault, but to their utter astonishment, all was as silent and motionless after the falling of the arrows as before. Then they discharged more arrows, and finding that they could not awaken any signs of life, they began to advance cautiously and entered the camp. They found, of course, that it had been entirely evacuated. They then rode around and around the enclosure, examining the ground with flambeaux and torches to find the tracks which Temujin's army had made in going away. The tracks were soon discovered. Those who first saw them immediately set off in pursuit of the fugitives, as they supposed them, shouting at the same time for the rest to follow. Some did follow immediately. Others, who had strayed away to greater or less distances on either side of the camp in search of the tracks, fell in by degrees as they received the order, while others still remained among the tents, where they were to be seen riding to and fro, endeavouring to make discoveries, or gathering together in groups to express to one another their astonishment, or to inquire what was next to be done. They, however, all gradually fell into the ranks of those who were following the tracks which had been found, and the whole body went on as fast as they could go, and in great confusion. They all supposed that Temujin and his troops were making a precipitate retreat, and were expecting every moment to come up to him in his rear, in which case he would be taken at great disadvantage, and would be easily overwhelmed. Instead of this, Temujin was just coming forward from his hiding place with his squadrons all in perfect order and advancing in a firm, steady and compact column, all being ready at the word of command to charge in good order but with terrible impetuosity, upon the advancing enemy. In this way the two armies came together. The shock of the encounter was terrific. Temujin, as might have been expected, was completely victorious. The confused masses of Vang Khan's army were overborne, thrown into dreadful confusion, and trampled underfoot. Great numbers were killed. Those that escaped, being killed at once, turned and fled. San Kum was wounded in the face by an arrow, but he still was able to keep his seat upon his horse, and so galloped away. Those that succeeded in saving themselves got back as soon as they could into the road by which they came, and so made their way in detached and open parties to Karakorum. Of course, after this, Vang Khan could no longer dissimulate his hostility to Temujin, and both parties prepared for open war. The different historians, through whom we derive our information in respect to the life and adventures of Genghis Khan, have related the transactions which occurred after this open outbreak between Temujin and Vang Khan somewhat differently. Combining their accounts, we learn that both parties, after the battle, opened negotiations with such neighbouring tribes as they supposed likely to take sides in the conflict, each endeavouring to gain as many adherents as possible to his own cause. Temujin obtained the alliance and cooperation of a great number of Tartar princes who ruled over hordes that dwelt in that part of the country or among the mountains around. Some of these chieftains were his relatives. Others were induced to join him by being convinced that he would, in the end, prove to be stronger than Vang Khan, and being, in some sense, politicians as well as warriors, they wished to be sure of coming out at the close of the contest on the victorious side. There was a certain Khan named Turkili, who was a relative of Temujin and who commanded a very powerful tribe. On approaching the confines of his territory, Temujin, not being certain of Turkili's disposition toward him, sent forward an ambassador to announce his approach and to ask if Turkili still retained the friendship which had long subsisted between them. Turkili might, perhaps, have hesitated which side to join, but the presence of Temujin with his whole troop upon his frontier seems to have determined him. So he sent a favourable answer and at once espoused Temujin's cause. Many other chieftains joined Temujin in much the same way, and thus the forces under his command were constantly increased. At length, in his progress across the country, he came with his troop of followers to a place where there was a stream of salt or bitter water which was unfit to drink. Temujin encamped on the shores of this stream and performed a grand ceremony in which he himself and his allies banded themselves together in the most solemn manner. In the course of the ceremony, a horse was sacrificed on the shores of the stream. Temujin also took up some of the water from the brook and drank it, invoking heaven at the same time to witness a solemn vow which he made, that as long as he lived he would share with his officers and soldiers the bitter as well as the sweet, and imprecating curses upon himself if he should ever violate his oath. All his allies and officers did the same after him. This ceremony was long remembered in the army, all those who had been present and had taken part in it cherishing the recollection of it with pride and pleasure, and long afterward, when Temujin had attained to the height of his power and glory, his generals considered their having been present at this first solemn league and covenant as conferring upon them a sort of title of nobility by which they and their descendants were to be distinguished forever above all those whose adhesion to the cause of the conqueror dated from a later time. By this time Temujin began to feel quite strong. He moved on with his army till he came to the borders of a lake which was not a great way from Vang Khan's dominions. Here he encamped, and before proceeding any further he determined to try the effects upon the mind of Vang Khan of a letter of expostulation and remonstrance. So he wrote to him substantially as follows: "A great many years ago, in the time of my father, when you were driven from your throne by your enemies, my father came to your aid, defeated your enemies, and restored you. At a later time, after I had come into your dominions, your brother conspired against you with the Markats and the Naimans. I defeated them and helped you to recover your power. When you were reduced to great distress, I shared with you my flocks and everything that I had. At another time, when you were in circumstances of great danger and distress, you sent to me to ask that my 4 interprets might go and rescue you. I sent them according to your request, and they delivered you from a most imminent danger. They helped you to conquer your enemies and to recover an immense booty from them. In many other instances, when the Khans have combined against you, I have given you most effectual aid in subduing them. How is it then, after receiving all these benefits from me for a period of so many years, that you form plans to destroy me in so base and so treacherous a manner? This letter seems to have produced some impression upon Van Khan's mind, but he was now, it seems, so much under the influence of Sankum and Yamuka that he could decide nothing for himself. He sent the letter to Sankum to ask him what answer should be returned. But Sankum, in addition to his former feelings of envy and jealousy against Temujin, was now irritated and angry in consequence of the wound that he had received, and determined to have his revenge. He would not hear of any accommodation. In the meantime, the Khans of all the Tartar and Mongol tribes that lived in the countries bordering on Van Khan's dominions, hearing of the rupture between Van Khan and Temujin, and aware of the great struggle for the mastery between these two potentates that was about to take place, became more and more interested in the quarrel. Temujin was very active in opening negotiations with them, and in endeavouring to induce them to take his side. He was a comparatively young and rising man, while Van Khan was becoming advanced in years and was now almost wholly under the influence of Sankum and Yamuka. Temujin, moreover, had already acquired great fame and great popularity as a commander, and his reputation was increasing every day, while Van Khan's glory was evidently on the wane. A great number of the Khans were, of course, predisposed to take Temujin's side. Others he compelled to join him by force, and others he persuaded by promising to release them from the exactions and the tyranny which Van Khan had exercised over them, and declaring that he was a messenger especially sent from heaven to accomplish their deliverance. Those Asiatic tribes were always ready to believe in military messengers sent from heaven to make conquests for their benefit. Among other nations who joined Temujin at this time were the people of his own country of Mongolistan proper. He was received very joyfully by his stepfather, who was in command there, and by all his former subjects, and they all promised to sustain him in the coming war. After a time when Temujin had, by these and similar means, greatly increased the number of his adherents and proportionately strengthened his position, he sent an ambassador again to Van Khan to propose some accommodation. Van Khan called a council to consider the proposal, but Sankum and Yamuka persisted in refusing to allow any accommodation to be made. They declared that they would not listen to proposals of peace on any other condition than that of the absolute surrender of Temujin and of all who were confederate with him to Van Khan as their lawful sovereign. Sankum himself delivered the message to the ambassador. "Tell the rebel Mongols," said he, "that they are to expect no peace but by submitting absolutely to the Khan's will. And as for Temujin, I will never see him again till I come to him sword in hand to kill him." Immediately after this, Sankum and Yamuka sent off some small plundering expeditions into the Mongol country, but they were all driven back by Temujin's troops without effecting their purpose. The result of these skirmishes was, however, greatly to exasperate both parties and to lead them to prepare in earnest for open war. Chapter 9. The Death of Van Khan, 1202. A grand council was now called of all the confederates who were leagued with Temujin at a place called Mankurle to make arrangements for a vigorous prosecution of the war. At this council were convened all the chieftains and khans that had been induced to declare against Vang Khan. Each one came attended by a considerable body of troops as his escort, and a grand deliberation was held. Some were in favour of trying once more to come to some terms of accommodation with Vang Khan, but Temujin convinced them that there was nothing to be hoped for except on condition of absolute submission, and that, in that case, Vang Khan would never be content until he had effected the utter ruin of everyone who had been engaged in the rebellion. So it was at last decided that every man should return to his own tribe and there raise as large a force as he could, with a view to carrying on the war with the utmost vigour. Temujin was formally appointed General-in-Chief of the army to be raised. There was a sort of truncheon or ornamented club called the topaz, which it was customary on such occasions to bestow with great solemnity on the general thus chosen as his badge of command. The topaz was, in this instance, conferred upon Temujin with all the usual ceremonies. He accepted it on the express condition that every man would punctually and implicitly obey all his orders, and that he should have absolute power to punish anyone who should disobey him in the way that he judged best, and that they should submit without question to all his decisions. To these conditions they all solemnly agreed. Being thus regularly placed in command, Temujin began by giving places of honour and authority to those who left Vang Khan's service to follow him. He took this occasion to remember and reward the 2 slaves who had come to him in the night at his camp some time before, to give him warning of the design of Sankum and Yamuka to come and surprise him there. He gave the slaves their freedom and made provision for their maintenance as long as they should live. He also put them on the list of exempts. The exempts were a class of persons upon whom, as a reward for great public services, were conferred certain exclusive rights and privileges. They had no taxes to pay. In case of plunder taken from the enemy, they received their full share without any deduction, while all the others were obliged to contribute a portion of their share for the Khan. The exempts, too, were allowed various other privileges. They had the right to go into the presence of the Khan at any time without waiting, as others were obliged to do, till they obtained permission, and, what was more singular still, they were entitled to 9 pardons for any offences that they might commit, so that it was only when they had committed 10 misdemeanours or crimes that they were in danger of punishment. The privileges which Temujin thus bestowed upon the slaves were to be continued to their descendants to the 7th generation. Temujin rewarded the slaves in this beautiful manner, partly, no doubt, out of sincere gratitude to them for having been the means, probably, of saving him and his army from destruction, and partly for effect, in order to impress upon his followers a strong conviction that any great services rendered to him or to his cause were certain to be well rewarded. Temujin now found himself at the very head of a very large body of men, and his first care was to establish a settled system of discipline among them, so that they could act with regularity and order when coming into battle. He divided his army into 3 separate bodies. The centre was composed of his own guards and was commanded by himself. The wings were formed of the squadrons of his confederates and allies. His plan in coming into battle was to send forward the 2 wings, retaining the centre as a reserve, and hold them prepared to rush in with irresistible power whenever the time should arrive at which their coming would produce the greatest effect. When everything was thus arranged, Temujin set his army in motion and began to advance toward the country of Vang Khan. The squadrons which composed his immense horde were so numerous that they covered all the plain. In the meantime, Vang Khan had not been idle. He, or rather Sankum and Yamuka, acting in his name, had assembled a great army, and he had set out on his march from Karakorum to meet his enemy. His forces, however, though more numerous, were by no means so well disciplined and arranged as those of Temujin. They were greatly encumbered too with baggage, the army being followed in its march by endless trains of wagons conveying provisions, arms, and military stores of all kinds. Its progress was, therefore, necessarily slow, for the troops of horsemen were obliged to regulate their speed by the movement of the wagons, which, on account of the heavy burdens that they contained and the want of finished roads, was necessarily slow. The two armies met upon a plain between two rivers, and a most desperate and bloody battle ensued. Karashar, Temujin's former tutor, led one of the divisions of Temujin's army and was opposed by Yemuka, who headed the wing of Vang Khan's army which confronted his division. The other wings attacked each other too, in the most furious manner, and for 3 hours it was doubtful which party would be successful. At length Temujin, who had all this time remained in the background with his reserve, saw that the favourable moment had arrived for him to intervene, and he gave the order for his guards to charge, which they did with such impetuosity as to carry all before them. One after another of Vang Khan's squadrons was overpowered, thrown into confusion, and driven from the field. It was not long before Vang Khan saw that all was lost. He gave up the contest and fled. A small troop of horsemen, consisting of his immediate attendants and guards, went with him. At first the fugitives took the road toward Karakorum. They were, however, so hotly pursued that they were obliged to turn off in another direction, and finally Vang Khan resolved to fly from his own country altogether and appeal for protection to a certain chieftain named Taiyan Khan, who ruled over a great horde called the Naimans, one of the most powerful tribes in the country of Karakatai. This Taiyan was the father of Temujin's first wife, the young princess to whom he was married during the lifetime of his father, when he was only about 14 years old. It was thought strange that Vang Khan should thus seek refuge among the Naimans, for he had not, for some time past, been on friendly terms either with Taiyan the Khan or with the tribe. There were, in particular, a considerable number of the subordinate chieftains who cherished a deep-seated resentment against him for injuries which he had inflicted upon them and upon their country in former wars. But all these Tartar tribes entertained very high ideas of the obligations of hospitality, and Vang Khan thought that when the Naimans saw him coming among them, a fugitive and in distress, they would lay aside their animosity and give him a kind reception. Indeed, Taiyan himself, on whom, as the head of the tribe, the chief discredit would attach of any evil befalling a visitor and a guest who had come in his distress to seek hospitality, was inclined, at first, to receive his enemy kindly and to offer him a refuge. He debated the matter with the other chieftains after Vang Khan had entered his dominions and was approaching his camp, but they were extremely unwilling that any mercy should be shown to their fallen enemy. They represented to Taiyan how great an enemy he had always been to them. They exaggerated the injuries which he had done to them and represented them in their worst light. They said, moreover, that by harbouring Vang Khan they should only involve themselves in a war with Temujin, who would undoubtedly follow his enemy into their country and would greatly resent any attempt on their part to protect him. These considerations had great effect on the mind of Taiyan, but still he could not bring himself to give his formal consent to any act of hostility against Vang Khan. So the other chieftains held a council among themselves to consider what they should do. They resolved to take upon themselves the responsibility of slaying Vang Khan. "We cannot induce Taiyan openly to authorize it," they said, "but he secretly desires it, and he will be glad when it's done." Taiyan knew very well what course things were taking, though he pretended not to know, and so allowed the other chiefs to go on in their own way. They accordingly fitted out a troop, and two of the chieftains, the two who felt the most bitter and determined hatred against Vang Khan, placing themselves at the head of it, set off to intercept him. He had lingered on the way, it seems, after entering the Naiman territory, in order to learn, before he advanced too far, what reception he was likely to meet with. The troop of Naimans came suddenly upon him in his encampment, slew all his attendants, and, seizing Van Khan, they cut off his head. They left the body where it lay and carried off the head to show it to Taiyan. Taiyan was secretly pleased, and he could not quite conceal the gratification which the death of his old enemy afforded him. He even addressed the head in words of scorn and spite, which revealed the exultation that he felt at the downfall of his rival. Then, however, checking himself, he blamed the chieftains for killing him. "Considering his venerable age," said he, "and his past greatness and renown as a prince and commander, you would have done much better to have acted as his guards than as his executioners." Taiyan ordered the head to be treated with the utmost respect. After properly preparing it by some process of drying and preserving, he caused it to be enclosed in a case of silver and set in a place of honour. While the preparations for this sort of entombment were making, the head was an object of a very solemn and mysterious interest for all the horde. They said that the tongue thrust itself several times out of the mouth, and the soothsayers, who watched the changes with great attention, drew from them important presages in respect of the coming events of the war. These presages were strongly in favour of the increasing prosperity and power of Temujin. Sankum, the son of Van Khan, was killed in the battle, but Yamuka escaped.